So hello, welcome. Glad for those of you who can be here in person and for those of you who are watching the recording, I hope you enjoy our talk about Ikigai. I learned about Ikigai a few years ago, and my interest in it has to do with how it affects health. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start by looking at the landscape of health and where we are right now in the United States. Then we'll talk a little bit more about Ikigai. Then we're going to talk about eudaimonic versus hedonic happiness. And then let's talk about the future. So to get started, what's the landscape look like? I think all you really have to look at are the top 7 jobs of 2024 to see where we're at. If you look at this list, the first thing you might notice is that 3 of the jobs are mental health therapist oriented jobs because we are not in the best mental health shape. In fact, what we're seeing is that burnout and stress is at an all-time high. As of 2022, the American Psychological Association did a survey, and they showed that 79% of employees had experienced work-related stress. 3 out of 5 report lack of interest and motivation. 26% report lack of energy, 19% lack of effort at work, 36% reported cognitive weariness, 32% reported emotional exhaustion, and 44% report physical fatigue. How do you think we're doing since 2022? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? Yeah, it's getting worse. So here's our 2023 update. 81% of Americans reported being stressed due to supply chain issues. 87% are stressed due to rising inflation. 80% are tensed and stressed about Russian cyber attacks and nuclear threats to the US. 69% of Americans fear that a World War III could break out and that we're in the genesis phase of it. And 65% of Americans respond that they're stressed about money and the economy. The pandemic made us stressed too. And actually, what we saw is that 42% of Americans, adults, gained weight during the pandemic. And the average amount of weight gained was 29 pounds. That's not a small amount of weight. That's a lot of weight. 10% of people gained more than 50 pounds during the pandemic. We also have sleep issues. 67% of Americans are sleeping more or less since the pandemic started, meaning 35% are getting less sleep. They're just waking up and can't go back to sleep, insomnia. And 31% are sleeping more than 10 hours a night. I don't know how they have time to sleep more than 10 hours a night. I can usually not even find time to sleep 8 hours a night, but there you go. And 23% of people are reporting drinking more alcohol to cope with stress. We also have 58% of the Gen Zs, which is age 11 to 26, say their lives have worsened since the pandemic. And what the American Psychological Association is saying now is that the US has collectively suffered a trauma. I mean, the world really collectively suffered a trauma, which means that people are more sensitive to daily hassles. There's a negative general life outlook and goals, and people are being diagnosed with chronic health conditions that are related to chronic stress. In other words, the landscape is not looking great. And it has to do with stress. So let's talk about stress. Stress is this perception of threat to either our physiological or our psychological well-being. And it's the perception that the individual's responses are inadequate to cope with it. So stress is really about our ability to cope. If you can cope with an issue, you're not stressed about it. But if you don't feel like you have the resources to cope with it, then stress becomes problematic. Now, stress is, because of this ability to cope, stress is determined by our own perception of it, meaning that what Thoreau said is that it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. I like to give this little example when I talk about stress because I have this example from a friend of mine and I who went to a play. And it turned out that this play it was called Kiss Me Kate. It's a Cole Porter play, and it's a musical. And they were doing it at the Colorado School of Mines. Now, I don't know if you know what the Colorado School of Mines is, but it is an engineering school. And I don't know what made us think that engineers could sing and dance, but it was terrible. It was awful. And so my friend Claire and I decided at the end of the first act that we needed to leave. So we waited for the lights to go down. And then as soon as the lights went down, we beelined for the back of the auditorium to leave. And what we didn't know is they were going to use that as a stage entrance for the next scene. And so the spotlight went on me and Claire trying to leave. I did what any normal stressed person would do, and I stopped, dropped, and rolled right into the back row of seats so nobody could see me. Claire was like a deer in headlights, and she just held on to the door until finally the guy who was leading the parade pushed her aside and marched on stage. Two totally different responses to the same stressful situation. So, as you can imagine, that's happening every day. We all have different responses to similar stressful situations. So, stress is not what happens to you, it's how you react to it. And what we commonly use as an example is people jumping out of airplanes. If you're a skydiver, jumping out of an airplane is not stressful. But if you are an average person who likes their feet on the ground, jumping out of an airplane can be a highly stressful event. Now, the issue that we have with stress is that it has effects over time. So usually, if you have normal, healthy stressors, you have a response to stress and then you recover from it. And then you have another response to stress and you recover from it. But if you're having too many stressors over a period of time, eventually you stop recovering. And eventually your body stops producing all the cortisol that it needs in order to respond to stress. And that's really when we get on overload. And that's where we are as a country. Now, stress in and of itself is not dangerous. In fact, we all need some stress in order to be functional adults. The problem is when we have too many stressful events happening right after each other. So I like this figure because it talks about how if our challenge level is low and our skill level is low, then we're in an apathetic situation. As we increase with our skills, if we aren't being challenged, we're going to get bored. And eventually, we're just kind of relaxed. If, on the other hand, we keep our skill level low, but we start getting challenged by more and more things, that's where we develop worry and then anxiety. But if our skill level matches our challenge level, eventually we feel like we're in control and we get into the flow. And that's when we're at our best. That's actually how athletes perform in a stressed situation. So if we can keep those good aspects well and under control, then we're going to be fine. The issue is we haven't been so good about keeping everything under control. So here's where we are so far. The landscape is a place where people are stressed out and they're lacking purpose. And stress and lack of purpose are significant contributors to health. So, what does Ikigai have to do with this? Well, first, I think we always need an excuse to smile. So happiness is intrinsic. It's about how you perceive the events in your life, and it's about the stories you tell yourself. Remember that your brain doesn't always discriminate between what you're saying as real or fiction. So you can tell yourself stories and make things worse than they are, or you can tell yourself stories and make things better than they are. Ikigai is this concept that when everything is working together, we reach a state of Ikigai. So Ikigai is commonly used in Japan to talk about work. And it happens when what you love overlaps with what you're good at, which overlaps with what you can be paid for, and that overlaps with what the world needs. Now, often we can hit two of these things. So maybe we're doing what we love and it's what we're good at. And so we have a passion and a profession, but it may not actually pay us very well. I give you college professor. Okay, well, there's a solution, right? You can do what you're getting, what you can be paid well for and what the world needs. And that might be a vocation, but you might not be doing what you love. And that might mean that you have excitement and complacency, but you also have a sense of uncertainty. Or you can do what you love and it could be what the world needs, but there's no wealth there. So what we really need is this combination of things. We need to be doing what we love and what we're good at, but it also needs to interact with what the world needs and what we can be paid for. And that's when we reach this state of Ikigai. So ultimately, we all need to find our Ikigai. And so now you're thinking, okay, Heather, how do I do that? Well, the first thing is we have to determine what is most important to ourselves in our lives. And the way you do that is you look back on your life and you reflect on your experiences and you realize what experiences you're good at. That allows you to explore potential paths and take some of those small steps. But remember, this is not only about what you're good at, this is also about what you're passionate about and who you are. And so you have to accept yourself in order to have Ikigai, and you have to stop comparing yourself to others. Your path is probably going to be different than theirs. And then you have to be mindful of how your actions are impacting others. Now, Ikigai can be applied to health. And I'm starting with a quote from Tracy Gaudet, and this is what inspired me to start looking at Ikigai. Imagine if the purpose of healthcare were to help people pause and reflect on what they actually want their health for, what brings them joy. Imagine if the purpose of healthcare were to provide people with the skill building and support they need to address their self-care so that they can live their most meaningful life. Imagine if this is the purpose of healthcare. Many things will change. That's something to wrap your brain around, right? That's nothing like what our healthcare system looks like today. So how did Tracy Gaudet get there? That's where we're going. So Ikigai happens when what we love overlaps with what we do well and what we can be paid for and what the world needs. And Ikigai could be applied to health, but it's not currently. So let's move on, and we're going to talk about eudaimonic and hedonic happiness. And in doing this, I'm going to tell you how Tracy Gaudet came to the conclusion that she did in that last quote. Tracy was working for the Veterans Administration, and she was the person who was supposed to bring integrative medicine and integrative health into the VA. What she immediately noticed is that veterans have a very high incidence of chronic disease. And when we say chronic disease, it's diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, autoimmunity, suicidality. There's so much chronic disease in veterans that they are often used as a population that we study for chronic disease. So Tracy started doing focus groups with these veterans. And what she discovered was that when they were discharged from the military, all of a sudden they lost their life purpose. Their purpose had been to serve the United States, and that is a noble purpose. And now you come back from being abroad and you're supposed to work at Home Depot? Like, it doesn't make sense. There's no purpose. And what would happen is as they lost their sense of purpose, the next thing we notice is they would stop taking care of their health. And next thing happens is chronic disease, addiction, suicide. But if you could convince veterans to find a purpose, their health immediately improves. Now, what could that purpose be? The purpose could be their family. The purpose could be a job that had some meaning. The purpose could be a religious purpose. It wasn't a single purpose that people had to find. It was individual to the veteran, but the purpose itself was important. How often does a physician ask a patient with chronic disease what their life purpose is? How often does anyone ask someone what their purpose is? And if that is truly the question we need to be asking, then we need to start changing how we do research and how we do healthcare. So Tracy's discovery with veterans led her to this conclusion. We're starting from the wrong place. To change the outcomes of the system, we need to change the conversation. We need to start with discovering what gives each of us a sense of meaning and purpose. What matters most deeply in our lives? How do we do that? Well, the ways that people typically find purpose is through volunteering, through family, through purposeful work, through spirituality, and to love others and be loved. And I hope that all of you have purpose. And I wonder, as we contemplate our healthcare system and training new physicians and thinking about how purpose fits into health, how do we start helping others find their purpose? And that leads to this question of, our purpose and happiness the same thing? So Barbara Fredrickson is a researcher at the University of North Carolina who wrote a book called Love 2.0. Great book, really interesting about the science of love. But in it and in her research, she talks about eudaimonic and hedonic happiness. So eudaimonic happiness is the type of happiness or contentment that is achieved through self-actualization and having meaningful purpose in one's life. Hedonic happiness is achieved through experiences of pleasure and enjoyment. Let's go get margaritas. That's eudaimonic, right? Let's go volunteer at a soup kitchen. That's eudaimonic. Another way to look at this, eudaimonic is a life that is satisfying. It's a fulfilling life. It's life purpose. It's holistic. It's life as a whole. It's feeling your life has meaning, purpose. Your experiences allow you to learn and grow and reach your full potential. Hedonic, those are experiences that are satisfying. Don't get me wrong. I like margaritas. I like going for a massage, but those momentary pleasures are actually at the moment feeling really good, but it's a temporary satisfaction. And that temporary satisfaction turns out to be a little bit problematic, because if we look at a life satisfaction scale, those hedonic experiences don't bring us true life satisfaction. So Barbara Fredrickson started looking at satisfaction, and she asked people how often in the past week they felt happy, how often they felt satisfied, how often that their life had a sense of direction, that they had something to contribute to society, and that they were challenged to grow and become a better person. When people scored high in life satisfaction, that was considered eudaimonic happiness. If people had hedonic happiness, that's fine, but it's different. And so then she looked at their immune system. And I'm an immunologist, so I, of course, am always going to be interested in the immune system. And here's what she saw. And I'm going to explain this to you. So if you're not familiar with graphs, that's okay. What we're going to see on the y-axis here is genes that are involved in inflammation. And what we see is, with hedonic happiness, we see an increase in inflammation. With eudaimonic happiness, we see a reduction in inflammation. Barbara then broke it down a little bit more, where she looked at hedonic and eudaimonic, and she's looking at different parts of the immune system. So inflammation is what causes us pain, like pain in our joints, pain in our back. And what we see is, with hedonic happiness, we see an increase in inflammation. We see a reduction in inflammation with eudaimonic happiness. Interferon is involved in helping us fight infection. With hedonic happiness, we see a little bit of increase in interferon. We see a lot more with eudaimonic happiness. And antibodies, well, we're all familiar with antibodies after this pandemic. Antibodies help us fight infection, and we see a reduction in antibodies with hedonic happiness and an increase in antibodies with eudaimonic happiness. In other words, eudaimonic wins. But why? Well, the reason, so first let me give you the punchline. Hedonic increases inflammation, eudaimonic decreases inflammation. Okay, why? It turns out with hedonism, there's a treadmill. So here's the treadmill. We start with desire. We want something. My dog is sitting beside me right now, and she very much wants a treat, but she's already had 6 in like the last hour, so she's not getting one. But we desire that thing, and we strive toward it, and then we obtain it, and we enjoy it. But what happens is we immediately adapt to having that thing, and then we want more, just like my dog, right? And it's this treadmill of desiring more. That's what's causing that stress, and that's what's causing that inflammation. So it's not that the pleasure is bad, it's the desire for more that leads us into problems. There's another way to look at this, and that is why people tend to become unhappy. So I thought this was an interesting figure, and I would share it with you. Why people tend to become unhappy is often what they're doing is they're setting their expectations unrealistically high. Now, it's not bad to have expectations, it's that our expectations need to be realistic. Another reason that people become unhappy is the I'm a snowflake argument. It's they think they're special, but they can't explain why they're special. I guarantee every one of us is special, but you have to understand where that comes from within you. Alternatively, they measure happiness in the wrong units. They think that happiness is about wealth, and happiness may really be about Zen. Or they get used to what they have and they want more. That's the hedonic adaptation that we just talked about. Here's another good one. They confuse not being bad with being good. I've had this discussion with a good friend of mine who he likes to challenge me and ask me if he's a good person. And I'm like, of course you're a good person. And he's like, don't get me wrong. I know I'm not a bad person. I am not robbing banks and knocking over little old ladies, but am I a good person? And if you're confused about that, you better figure it out, because being good is something that you should be proud of. They try to find meaning in being unhappy. Oh, I'm unhappy because of XYZ. And once there's meaning there, then they can justify their unhappiness. Or they hope that other people will make them happy. I think we all know not to find our happiness in a different person. Our happiness needs to come from within. Or they desire happiness less than they fear disappointment. They find commiserators. This person will be unhappy with me. They believe that happiness is a selfish pursuit. No, we all deserve to be happy. They think that misery follows happiness. I better not be happy because then the other foot's or shoe's gonna drop, right? Heard that one. Or they don't see the impact of their work. And this is a big one around life purpose. If what you do can't be measured and you can't feel how it's impacting others, that's very unsatisfying work. So let's look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And where meaning and purpose comes is at the top. We can't have meaning and purpose until our physiological needs are met first: water, warmth, rest. We can't have purpose until our safety is there. We need to feel secure and safe. We need to belong and love others. We need to have our relationships and our friends. And then we need our esteems, that sense of feeling and accomplishment. Then we move on to self-actualization, and finally we reach that transcendence sense of meaning and purpose. And so it's not any wonder that a lot of people at this point are lacking a sense of purpose when there are so many people who don't feel secure in their homes. There are so many people who don't have the finances that they need to survive as inflation is happening. There are people who have been isolated and continue to isolate even though as a pandemic, we're at 3% infection rate as opposed to 20% where we were a couple of years ago. So our building blocks of eudaimonic happiness are self-acceptance, autonomy, personal growth, mastering our environment, having a purpose in life, and having positive relationships. And these are things that are attainable once we can satisfy those lower levels of hierarchy of needs. So as we come back to Ikigai, it seems that if we're going to reduce inflammation and pain and chronic disease, one of the things we need to start doing is asking people if they're doing what they love and they're doing what they're good at and they're being paid what they need to be paid. And does the world need what they're doing? Because you can have Ikigai and be the guy who pumps gas at the Shell station if it's what the world needs and you can be paid for it and you're good at it and you love it. And believe me, one of the guys that works at our local Shell station absolutely loves his job and he is experiencing Ikigai every day. It's not that you have to be in a particular profession, it's that you have to have these things match up for yourself. So here's where we are so far. Happiness and life purpose are not exactly the same thing. Happiness is hedonic. Life purpose is eudaimonic. Eudaimonic happiness and hedonic happiness have different influences on inflammation. Neither one of those are my dog. Just thought I'd let you know. All right, so what does that mean to our future? It means that we need to change the landscape. Just like with nature, we like to rewild it. We need to bring things back to a more diverse nature. We need to change the landscape of how we do research, how we conduct healthcare, and are we asking the right questions? Because a lot of the questions that we ask are just looking for small changes. We do another drug study, we do another yoga study, another nutrition study. What we really need is disruptive change. We need people who want to build a new model, a model that incentivizes health as opposed to incentivizing disease. Currently, we have a medical model where the whole system makes money the sicker that people are. How do we disrupt that? How do we make the system make money when people are healthy and satisfied and happy? Because that's not working right now. So from Tracy, to sustain behavior change, which is very clearly difficult to do, one must be intrinsically motivated. Nobody else can make you make a behavior change. How does one become intrinsically motivated? Through their personal experience. And this is true for positive and negative behavior change. Experiencing a change in something that really matters to them is often the catalyst. So, what would the future look like if we made these changes to our healthcare system? Right now, we're focused on disease. In the future, it could be focused on the person and their purpose. Right now, it's problem-based. The future, aspiration-based. Currently, our healthcare is physician-directed, but in the future, patients are partnering with the team. As is, we're doing disease management. In the future, health optimization. As is, find it, fix it. In the future, identify it, minimize it. Instead of being reactive, can we be proactive? Instead of being sporadic, let's do lifelong planning. Instead of biomedical interventions, let's do whole person approaches. And instead of an individual left to enact on their health, let's do skill building and support in the workplace and the community. How will we know if we succeeded? Well, when we succeed, we're going to see an increase in physical and mental well-being. We'll see a decrease in pain, obesity, depression, and chronic conditions. We'll see an increase in self-care because people will value themselves. We'll see a decrease in clinical and pharmaceutical needs and decreased healthcare costs. We'll see an increase in employee engagement and business productivity because people love what they do. We'll see an increase in people's sense of meaning and purpose, connectivity and compassion. And boy, wouldn't that be nice? A transformation in social consciousness and a quantum leap in health, well-being, and collective humanity. That's what we're looking for. That's why we want people to pursue Ikigai. That's what I wanted to talk about today. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it could look like if we combined Ikigai and our healthcare system.